we'll get into our review in a second, but Gladiator II is a sequel to a very, very well known and very beloved movie, Gladiator, which came out in 2000. Again, it won a host of Academy Awards that year, including Best Picture,
Mm-hmm.
Best Actor for Russell Crowe. It pretty
Mm-hmm.
much put him on the map and made him a big, big star in Hollywood. And in terms of the the historical epics that sort of sort of dominated Hollywood in the late 90s and mid 2000s, this was really responsible for a lot of that resurgence. They were huge in Hollywood at one particular point in time, mostly in the 50s and the 60s, with the widescreen presentations, the roadshow
Mm-hmm.
presentations of a lot of the big old school epics like Ten Commandments and Spartacus and things of that nature. But they sort of fell out of favor, though never completely absent. But Braveheart in the late 90s from Mel Gibson, and then of course
Yeah.
Gladiator, I think did a lot to really create a resurgence around this particular genre. And then we got more. We got Troy and 300 that started to come out quite
All of that.
often.
Mm-hmm.
But Gladiator is it's one of the most well-known and one of the most beloved, I would certainly say. And the idea of a sequel has been gestating for a long time. They've been working on a sequel pretty much since the immediate aftermath of Gladiator. So far as back as 2001, Ridley Scott had ideas for making another Gladiator. At one point in time, he teased the idea of Russell Crowe even coming back. Spoiler alert for Gladiator. Russell Crowe dies. Sorry, the movie's 25 years old. Maximus dies in that movie, but they were toying with the idea that maybe they can do a sequel, bring him back from the dead. I don't know. Thankfully, they did not do that. But it just took a long time. The rights ultimately had to revert back to Paramount. It was a lot of legal stuff that went on, so went through a big amount of development hell for a while until about 2018 when really Scott really buckled down and was able to revisit the story and ultimately dedicate his time. And this is also interesting for him because he's coming off of really revisiting this genre in earnest over the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2021, he had The Last Duel. Last year, he had Napoleon. So he's returned to the genre that made him famous for a lot of people. His
Yeah.
first movie was The Duelist, also another historical epic.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did multiple movies, in this genre. Again, Gladiator sort of put him back on the map after having a bit of a downturn in the 90s for a little bit there. And so, I just want to start off with that part of the conversation. What's your relationship specifically to Gladiator, that movie that came out back in 2000?
It is one of my favorite movies, man. And I seen it so young, but it was one of those films. It really, that time for me was like, this is when I think I realized I started to love films again. The Gladiator 1 comes out. I'm only like 6 years old, but it's such an important moment in both filmmaking and I think my life, in the way just things were happening, man. That Gladiator comes out and I'm like, this movie is crazy. Like, it looks fantastic. Russell Crowe was really killing it on all fronts, and up until that point, of course, there's a lot of movies I love, but I feel like when I was watching that movie, I was like, there's a lot of quotables here. I was a young kid, like, dang, this is really good, and because again, in that time, like shortly after, and kind of in that same vein, like Lord of the Rings starts to happen, and it was just, I don't know, it was something about filmmaking in that time that really resonated with me. And so Gladiator does become one of my favorite films. I absolutely love that movie. I love, and it really is a classic hero film. Like, Russell Crowe in that movie was somebody you root for. And to see, I think, the way Gladiator has moved throughout history and how things have become, you can see Gladiator in so many other movies, and a protagonist like Maximus and so many other things has been really cool, man. So, man, Gladiator, one of my favorite Ridley Scott films in particular. Top 3 easy, Ridley Scott for me. But man, it was just a different time, and I've always kind of kept that movie with me. I've seen it so many times. It's been on TV. I've watched it with my cousins. We put it in multiple times. I mean, of course, I got the movie now. I've put it in. It's just one of those films that it looks really cool. It feels really cool. You're rooting for the hero. There's action. It's just a perfect movie to me, man. I thoroughly enjoy it. And the ending, what I love about Gladiator 1 is the ending isn't as perfect as it could be. You know what I mean? It's not just like some shoe in, yeah, we won. It's like, no, man, the hero kind of died. That wasn't exactly what we all were looking for. So I have a really special relationship to that first Gladiator, man. It's a film I hold near and dear for sure.
Yeah, this was another formative film for me as well. Saw it not in theaters, but saw it shortly after because it was on cable all the time.
All the time.
And I remember catching it and just being completely enthralled in the story, just the character and the journey that Maximus goes on, and the obstacles and everything that's thrown in his way. And we're also introduced to a young Joaquin Phoenix at the time, who becomes,
Hmm.
one of this generation's greatest actors, acting opposite Russell Crowe, who just had such a magnetic presence in that movie as that character. I mean, you really can't see anybody else playing that particular character, and just like what he went through and just everything that Russell Crowe brought. I mean, he deserved all the flowers that he got after that, and just how famous he became off of that role and the strength of that role, because it was really formative for him in his career. The action is incredible, and Ridley Scott's command as a filmmaker was on full display. I mean, he got all of his swagger back, all of his mojo back, and this was really the first
Hmm.
movie that I became aware of him as a filmmaker. I had
Hmm.
seen other movies, like I had seen Alien by this point, but I wasn't really aware of who Ridley Scott was. But then watching a lot of the behind the scenes stuff of this movie, which is what
Hmm.
really grew my relationship with it, because I'm like, how did they do this? How did they pull off
Hmm.
this Roman Coliseum? How did tigers end up in this shit? Like, I want to know how they made this movie. And that's how I was
Yeah.
introduced really to Ridley Scott as a filmmaker. And I'm like, oh, this guy is talented. And then you just go down the list and you see the other movies he's directed, and you see why he's had the long career that he has, is because
Hmm.
there's really not any other filmmaker in the world. There's probably like 4 or 5 others that can make a movie like this and can pull it off successfully. It's a very, I think, elite class of filmmaking, and what he achieved in that movie was just really special. And then of course all the box office success, the award success, it was really really huge, for both Ridley Scott and of course Russell Crowe at that particular time. And so coming into a sequel all these years later, knowing that we do now live in a time of legacy sequels, and that's become like
Hmm.
a popular thing to do, to revisit characters and stories from a previous generation, certainly cause to be concerned. And I think definitely a place to be concerned about. But we have been talking about this movie for a couple of years now. We started to hear about casting. We heard about
Hmm.
Paul Mescal coming off of some of the small indie darlings, and the performances that he was turning in. Denzel Washington, of course, huge star. Pedro Pascal, the king of television right now, coming into this world, had a
Yeah.
great cast. And I think knowing that Ridley was going to return to it and still be the director, though there was reasons to be concerned, I was also still like excited. Like, oh,
Hmm.
maybe this could be something. Maybe this can be like a really, really cool prospect to return to this world and to see a filmmaker revisit a place that he pretty much excelled at when he first revisited, or when he first visited that world in 2000. What were your, sort of expectations coming into it? Because again, like, he has been in this lane for a couple of years now with Napoleon and The
Hmm.
Last Duel.
Last
So he's
Duel.
he's kind of
Hmm.
been ramping up to the idea of revisiting Gladiator. He didn't just go cold turkey and do like
Yeah.
fucking, I don't know, Matchstick Men and then this movie. He kind of ramped up and got here to this point to
Yeah.
say like, yeah, guys, just so you know, like, I am good at this, but I'm also going to give you a little bit of a taste of, to what's to come. I'm going to revisit these historical time period pieces with these big sets, this big action, these big huge
Hmm.
stars, before I get back to the property that I think most of you probably know me for.
I think my expectations were kind of one. I think I was excited because I do like Gladiator. I mean, he has a couple of my favorite movies, right? Like I really love Alien, Blade Runner, Gladiator, The Martian's really good. But here recently, he has been more of a mixed bag for me. And not that anything, I don't think anything he's made recently has been bad, but doesn't necessarily mean it's worked for me or it's been good either. Like I like The Last Duel, but Napoleon, right? Like Napoleon is this really big. I love the set pieces in Napoleon, but as a story and the way the story goes, it's a little messy and a little wonky. And then here we go, House of Gucci. It's fine, but not so much. And so I think I was excited for him to get back to a story that he knows, that he resonates with, and that we all resonate with, while keeping a lot of those sensibilities he has in big action and in what it feels like to get back to a lot of those set piece movies. And so I was excited for it, but I also was like, all right, I need you to get it together, Ridley. Like I need you to bring me back full stop, because Napoleon didn't do that. And again, I like The Last Duel, but it didn't bring me all the way back. And House of Gucci didn't do that. So I'm like, okay, what do you got for me? And so the expectations, I was excited, but I also held him, I think, in a little bit of a higher regard of like, it's gonna take you a lot to kind of to reel me back in completely to who Ridley Scott is. So yeah, very high expectations, I would say.
Yeah, I've made no bones about it. I'm not a fan of legacy sequels and the idea of like revisiting a time and a place that we all have nostalgia for doesn't really entice me. It doesn't excite me. There have been exceptions, of course, that I've named on the podcast, but by and large, I'm like these don't work. They're just not as good as
Mm-hmm.
like what we're used to. And oftentimes, even if they are done by the same filmmaker or the same cast
Mm-hmm.
and crew, it's like, well, guys, you're not exactly in your prime anymore. Ridley, you are 87 years old. I love you, and you still are making pretty impressive films at that age, but it's not 2000. And that worked in that moment in time. It worked at that particular era, but it's not necessarily
Yeah.
going to translate here. And then you start announcing the cast, and it's like, wow, Paul Mescal, he's like one of the up and coming actors of his generation. He's really
Mm-hmm.
talented. Love him in everything I see him in. Denzel Washington. Oh, great. One of my favorite actors of all time. That's a get. Pedro Pascal. Oh, wow. I love him in pretty much everything. The Mandalorian, The
Yeah.
Last of Us. He's incredible. Connie Nielson's going to come back. Cool. Okay. We got our tie and
Mm-hmm.
tether to the first movie. So it's like, all right, you're doing everything to win me over, but the final product, we have to ultimately see what that's going to look like. But at the same time, what I was excited about, what I knew was always going to be the case, just because this is Ridley as a filmmaker, he is not taking any shortcuts. He's doing
Mm-hmm.
everything as real as possible for the most part. Everything is pretty much going to look probably spectacular and look better than most films that are coming out just because he's an old school filmmaker. He comes from generations ago of doing things real and practical because that was the only option. You didn't really have any other options. You had to. And he's always retained that element of just tactile realism in his movies. I mean, you look at the set pieces in Napoleon, though it's not really a great movie, the set pieces there are awe-inspiring.
They are.
Nobody else can really pull that stuff off. Or even The Last Duel, which is a little bit smaller scale, the
Mm-hmm.
fights and the choreography, incredible stuff. And so it's like, as a filmmaker, just like what he's going to do and what he's going to achieve from that level. And I'm like, hey, if we can get that done really, really well in this day and age with
Mm-hmm.
this technology and just the advancements that have been made, there might be something there. And then we have to make sure that the story is going to live up to that moment and live up to that reputation as well. And so that leads us to now our thoughts on this Gladiator 2 movie and the sequel and what they've done here. So before we dive into like some of the more specific things and open up the conversation, what were your overall quick thoughts on Gladiator 2?
You speak about Ridley Scott being 87 years old, and what's so interesting about Gladiator 2 is I feel like all of his sensibilities have almost rewound themselves in a lot of ways, and you could kind of see it in Napoleon as well. But Gladiator 2, a lot of it feels like, hello, I'm Ridley Scott, but what would I do if I was, I don't know, if I was in my 20s again? There's so much action in Gladiator 2, a lot of things that happen in Gladiator 2 that's like, that feels kind of childish sometimes, of like, okay, what if we do this big thing? Oh, you know what? We need sharks. Oh yeah, not only do we need sharks, we need, I don't know, there's just these set pieces where he feels like he's going above and beyond for what his imagination would be if his younger self was here. And I think he's enacting on those, and it doesn't necessarily always work, but sometimes it's fun to be like, okay, that was a cool camera angle. What is that thing over here? What is that thing over there? I think Gladiator 2 comes in, and it's such an interesting experiment because not everything works for me at all. Nor do I think it's a bad movie. And part of that though is because the first half of the movie is Gladiator 1. It's the same thing. It's the exact same film. There are almost no differences beyond it being shot in today's age, and it's just 2024. And then you replace it, your main character Russell, instead of it being Russell Crowe, you replace him with Paul Mescal, which is another part of the reason this film just doesn't work at probably as much as it should. And I love Paul Mescal. I think he's fantastic, still a fantastic actor. By no means do I think, I wouldn't even say his performance was bad in this film, but there is a level of being able to command the screen in charisma that Russell Crowe had, simply that Paul Mescal just did not have here. And I almost think I would have liked his performance had we gotten a different kind of movie than just Gladiator 1 redone again. In fact, if he decided to do a more story driven film, then I would have been fine with it. Like, why not just, I don't know, why not do something different, Ridley Scott? And I think there are moments where he wanted to kind of do something different. Was the first half of the movie is Gladiator 1, the second half of the movie you're like, okay, you've already done all of Gladiator 1, now what are you going to do, and will these beats work for me? And unfortunately not all of them necessarily work, right? And like a lot of them are interesting choices, but they, by that time you're like an hour and a half in the movie and now you're like, well, now what are we doing? And sometimes it works, and the reason why sometimes it works is because you have Denzel Washington. If you didn't have Denzel Washington, for me, a lot of that stuff probably wouldn't have ended up working. But you almost kind of got lucky that you had Denzel there. You almost kind of got lucky, honestly, that you had Connie Nielson there. I actually really like Connie Nielson in this movie. I think she did really good. But Pedro Pascal, I thought he wasn't in the movie as much as I thought he was going to be, and also he didn't have much to do. But when Connie Nielson was on screen, I think she did add something a little different. And of course, Denzel is a scene stiller. He's doing what I thought he was going to do. But again, by those moments, you're like, I don't know. I feel like maybe we should have made some of these choices potentially earlier and not have copy and pasted what we did in the first Gladiator to kind of set this thing up. That being said, it's a fine movie. It's still a fun watch. I love Ridley Scott in this level of filmmaking, still building all these sets. It looks fantastic. The camera angles feel fantastic. I love how bombastic these things are. But by the end of it, I'm not left with much outside of, wow, this is, again, a copy and paste of what we did kind of before, but now we've added some Denzel Washington in it. I feel like we sprinkled a little bit of parsley in the film. We don't have Joaquin Phoenix per se. Instead, we get Joseph Quinn in who was it?
Fred Hetchinker.
I mean, Fred Hetchinker, and they're fine, but they don't bring what Joaquin was bringing. You know, it just feels different. It doesn't feel the same. So I think this is still in terms of a blockbuster, you just want to eat popcorn and all that, it does fine. But as a sequel to a story, it doesn't do all that much. And that really is where kind of I left with Gladiator. I think I was looking for more by way of story, but I think the blockbuster parts, the sensibilities I got, but it was left to be desired, I think, on the story side of things, and a little bit in the way of by our protagonist. What we had with Lucius and what Paul Mescal had to do, I think there was a little bit more to be desired in that part as well. I want to add one more thing. I love quotables. This movie does have a couple. I really like when you're able to throw in like little poems, like historical poems. That stuff always works for me. I'm a sucker for that stuff. And I think had there been more story, some of that stuff would have resonated with me more. Instead, it kind of just get lost in what this movie ends up being, and that's unfortunate as well.
I'll give the short of it. Gladiator II is no Gladiator. It's certainly nowhere near the level of that film, nor was it ever going to be. But even more than that, it was overall just a disappointing film experience, because I think what I walked away with after I saw this movie was the idea that it had no purpose and no reason to exist. And that's the worst feeling that I think I can ever have with the movie. Like, this literally did not even have to happen. We don't need this movie. It doesn't really add anything at all to just the mythology and the lore. And it certainly doesn't do anything different. You said the first part is Gladiator. I think the whole movie is just a repetition of Gladiator. I think literally the entire film is the whole first film done over for the most part, with the literal exception of the ending in and of itself. That's it. Mm-hmm. Everything else is just mapped on to what we previously saw from Russell Crowe and Ridley Scott in 2000. And anytime you have that, it's like, well, that's kind of a waste. I can get big blockbuster action from elsewhere, though I do enjoy Ridley and what he brings to the table in that regard. And he is special, and he does know how to do that. And he's more than capable, more capable than most other directors. We do have a couple of other directors out there right now that can do it and give you a very meaningful, satisfying story. And this just didn't do that for me. So this is just a big, huge letdown. And it's just ultimately a movie that doesn't need to exist beyond the performances in it, beyond the story that they tell. I'll get more into that stuff in a second here. But ultimately, Gladiator 2, it's, again, falling into that category of legacy sequels where I'm just like, yeah, guys, you added almost nothing here for me. And this is why the whole proposition of them existing and revisiting these places that we enjoy so well, it's a very, very difficult proposition. It's something that, most most filmmakers and studios, they shouldn't even dare try to touch it. But just, in the state that we are, the capitalistic society that we are, they're always going to. They're going to give it a shot and try to, but it's just not ever going to amount to anything that's really worthwhile, especially considering that the legacy of that first one looms so large. I think for a lot of people stepping up to the plate to do this one, it was ill-fated. I think it was ultimately just not that interesting. I want to talk about Lucius, played by Paul Mescal here. But to be honest, it's hard to really talk about this without getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So I think we need to spoil this movie. I think we need to actually get into it and talk about the actual details of what this is about and who he is. So I will warn people, we are going to spoil a very, very pivotal plot point to this movie, because I think it's almost just impossible to talk about it, especially in relationship to the first one, without addressing it. I think we have to get to it. So if you don't want to know anything about Gladiator II, especially a very important plot piece, go watch it and then come finish out the rest of this conversation. But I want to talk about the main character here, played by Paul Mescal. They essentially reveal here that he is the son of Maximus from the first movie, played by Russell Crowe. Now, did you know this going into the movie? Did you know that this was going to be a very pivotal story element at all? Because I'm a little hazy on whether or not that this was talked about or revealed, because I knew, it was never a question for me. I was not shocked at all. In fact, I thought that this was well known, but apparently it wasn't. So what was your experience? Did you know coming into this that they were going to tie the Lucius character directly into Maximus?
I had a feeling. I didn't no per se. I also wasn't surprised when I did figure out or when they did reveal it, but I also was I wasn't sure if I remembered it being part of the marketing or in anything like that, which is funny now. If you look up, again, the very basic summary, or not summary, but the log line of the movie, whatever, it literally tells you it's Lucius. It's oh, shoot. Okay, Lucius. But I don't know. I don't know if I remember them being this is Lucius. I don't know if I remember that.
Yeah, I truly cannot remember if this was ever tipped off in any marketing, but I feel like I was having a conversation with somebody and they were like, well, why are they doing this? Is it directly tied into the first one? And I was like, actually, I don't know. And then I went and read the synopsis and I saw it in there and I was like, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. I figured that they would probably make him his son somehow, because in the first one they do allude to the fact that Maximus and Connie Nielson's character had a romantic relationship with each other. They had a romantic past, but they never actually say oh, we have a child out there, we have a bastard son. In the first one, Maximus's wife, his actual wife, and his son, they get killed. But they allude to this relationship that they had, and so I just figured, I was like, yeah, he's gonna be a son. And so when it was revealed in the movie, it was not a shock at all. And probably even for people who didn't know, it probably wasn't this big revelation, because they sort of build up to it anyway. But even more importantly than that in and of itself is, I think, how much that does affect the viewing experience of the movie, because now we're tethering the Paul Mescal character to the Russell Crowe character.
Yeah.
And that is a very tough thing to be doing, considering what you mentioned earlier about the performance of Russell Crowe and how charismatic he was and how much he commanded the screen and how much he's really tied into the role of Maximus. And Paul Mescal, I mean, again, love the guy, and I don't think that this is his fault at all. I just don't think he was put in the best position to succeed here. But, this is a big, juicy part, a big, epic action film that requires you acting opposite of some very, very heavy hitters on the screen, like a Denzel and Pedro Pascal and Connie Nielson. And Pedro, or excuse me, Paul Mescal, he's known to be more of this this sensitive masculine guy. He's done things like All of Us Strangers and After Sun, playing these really sensitive masculine roles that showcase a lot of his range. But now he's stepping into this role that doesn't really require as much range, at least the way in which it's written. And I just don't think he was set up to succeed in this particular instance and being able to showcase what his true acting ability is, because it almost required too little of him. I feel like if maybe it required more of him, he probably would have been more successful. But the role is kind of one note, if we're being honest about it. So, what else did you want to say about Paul Mescal's performance and just how challenging that was? Because there's also the physical element too, which is another aspect, to examine. But just from an acting and performance standpoint, what were your thoughts there?
Yeah, the way he played this character was it was a little bit more reserved. And that is it is interesting because that is something Russell Crowe I think had to do in the first Gladiator. Like, he doesn't always speak in the beginning of the movie, right? Like, clearly he's been through a lot, he's hurt, his arm is messed up, and when he starts to get sold into slavery in a couple of those moments, he's also not speaking a ton, but he does have a different way, I think, in which he plays it, of being like this force. I can't explain it, but he has this presence of like, I can at any moment I can whip y'all ass. You know what I'm saying? Or I could do this thing. And Paul Mescal doesn't necessarily, I feel like he's like brooding internally versus like necessarily showing like, no, I can whoop anybody. He doesn't have like that, I can whoop your ass right now if I need to. Instead, it kind of comes out when he has to. It kind of comes out when he absolutely has to. He doesn't necessarily feel like that's the case for him. He's playing as so much more, he's playing as so much more cool guy. That's the good way to put it. Like, Paul Mescal here is the cool guy, and part of me wishes he was a more like just a force, man. I don't know. Russell Crowe again had a different charisma to him, and Paul Mescal was just a little bit more reserved, I think, in what he had or what he was bringing to the forefront here. Like you said, I think he just didn't have as much to work with, and so everything kind of feels one note, but kind of that feeling is just like, yeah, I'm gonna look at you a certain way. Part of me wishes he had more lines to get him to get to that charismatic moment, the charismatic performance, but he just doesn't. He just didn't necessarily have it. There are times where I'm like, oh, okay, you almost did it, and then it goes back into the wayside. Versus Russell Crowe, I feel like I felt it throughout the whole runtime.
Yeah, I don't even know if Paul Mescal knew what to do with this material, to be honest, because he's never
Yeah.
played anything like this. And I think that was a big challenge, perhaps, with just like illustrating and bringing to life like what this character is and what he means. And also the fact that like he's living in somewhat of a different reality in terms of who his identity is. Like, that's also like another hurdle that you have to overcome as a character, not knowing like your true lineage or not remembering your lineage. And then along the way, like, oh yeah, by the way, you are, the son of this very, very famous figure, that preceded you by 16 years or so, according to the story. So it's just, physically, I thought he was good. He looked really good physically in the fights, but the performances, I mean, that's what matters at the end of the day. And it just doesn't stack up to just, again, this really, really iconic portrayal of what Russell Crowe had to do in that first one. And I think it just boils down to the material. I don't think it suited his specific talents. Like, I guess he was miscast, I guess, technically, but I only say that because of the way it was written. If it was written to suit him, he would have been great. But you have to know what type of performer he is and know what he's been good at. Because if you see his other movies, he's really good in those roles. But when it comes time to play this type of character, it just didn't serve him well. Denzel, obviously, a lot of conversation about him in this film. Who, by the way, Denzel is on the promo run of a lifetime right now.
Crazy.
It is historic. It's iconic. I think he's just reached that age in which, he's very, very forthcoming about a lot of stuff. We kind of got the sense of that when we went to the American Black Film Festival earlier this year. He just let loose. That was kind of a prelude to what he's been doing on this press run. I mean, he's just been so honest, talking about, old stuff. He brought up the jealousy he had towards Kevin Spacey at the Oscars in 2000 for losing. He's talked about how he's been sober for 10 years. He's boxing now. He dropped that huge news about, potentially being in Black Panther 3 and retirement, but then he had to walk it back like, hey guys, calm down. I just want to direct more in the future. That's all I meant. But either way, he's having a lot of fun, and he's having a lot of fun in this movie as well. And he's been kind of the most praised aspect of this film. And I find it interesting because if I'm being honest, and Denzel is one of my favorite actors of all time, so this is never taking anything away from him. He is the best part of this movie, and I do think he's pretty terrific. However, this is not top tier Denzel, first and foremost. This is, maybe like his 16th best performance of his career.
Yep.
And secondly, I think the reason, to be honest, that he is so good in this movie is because, for me, the movie is so mediocre. And I think that his performance just rises to the top because like everything else around him is just not that great. So we have no choice but to look at him and say like, oh my God, thank God Denzel is back in the scene. Thank God he's back. And anytime he's not on screen, it's like I'm kind of wondering where Macrinus is. Like, what's Macrinus up to right now? Like, what type of conniving shit is he doing? And so, he is really good, but I think it's just kind of due to the fact that the film around him just kind of falters for the most part. And he really is the only performance that's memorable. There really isn't any other performance in this movie that you walk away from thinking about. But because Denzel is just such a titan of the screen, he's so commanding and so forceful, and he can do anything with any character almost, especially when he gets to be a little bit more villainous and be a little bit more evil. It's just juicy, and it's juicier for him to play. So what were your thoughts on just like what he brought to the movie and just the energy and how it changed anytime he was a part of a scene?
Man, I'm so glad you said all that because I agree 1000%. Oh my God. I just think I do like him in this movie. I think he's really good in this film. And I also think he does make interesting choices with Macrinus within this film. I think he has a decent backstory, and what he gives to the story is kind of cool. But I was watching like, this is, I don't know, because coming into this, I just heard so much praise, I think, about his performance. And after watching the film, I was like, I thought there was more. I don't know. I thought y'all were talking about something else, like a different kind of performance, and that's not the sense that I got after seeing the film. And again, like you said, there were nobody else was making as interesting choices as Denzel was making. I think that's it. Everybody else was kind of either had to be one note or again, I do like Connie Nielson. She was doing what she had to do, but other than that, man, like he was it. He was the only person that was really like giving us something else. And I think that's why people are pointing to it, like, because there are also some things I think to praise about the film. Again, when it comes to some filmmaking kind of things, when it comes to acting, it's like, but that Denzel, it's like, what else is there to kind of talk about? And I think that was it. But yeah, I think that's it, man. I think I enjoyed it, but I don't put it in an upper echelon of Denzel performances, though I did enjoy it. But I think I think he did bring something to the table that was just so different from everybody else, and because he was probably the more interesting part of the movie. That's also it. It was like, yeah, like you said, when he's not on screen, it's like, what you got going on? What are you doing? Where he at? Because part of me also feels like it would have been cool if we seen the movie from his perspective. Part of me was like, what would that movie look like? And of course we don't get that. It's a different kind of film in Gladiator, but I was like, shoot, we might as well just have went there because that's damn near what I wanted to see anyway. So yeah, man, I feel the same way. I think it's so interesting to hear people talk about the performance and to see the performance. They definitely feel like two different things to me. I definitely enjoy them, but yeah, just not what I thought it was going to be.
The character is more interesting, Macrinus, than Lucius, because I mean he's a former slave, and now he's done some pretty insidious things to kind of rise up in the ranks and assume power. And that's just a more interesting trajectory for his character, especially as you start to see him accumulate that power and maneuver. It's very Game of Thrones like to see somebody just sort of work the system and to make it work for them, and then they ultimately get the throne or the crown or whatever the case may be. And the drip was fucking immaculate. The costumes on Denzel, the robes,
fantastic,
the jewelry, the rings. I mean, everything he was living luscious. I mean, he was having a grand old time, looked $1,000,000. And so I loved all that stuff. But, to be honest about everybody else, like I didn't really, and I enjoyed Connie Nielson. I didn't think she really added that much to the movie for me. She certainly doesn't add anything to the first movie. She was hugely underserved in that first movie.
In the first one.
So they did give her more here, which I appreciate, but the performance didn't, I don't know, it didn't resonate with me as much. But I think the biggest, most egregious behavior is what they did with Pedro Pascal, who had almost like nothing to do.
Nothing.
I just don't get that at all. I just don't understand because, again, another great physical actor. When you see him show up in Game of Thrones and really kind of steal those scenes in season 4, and he does that battle stuff. I mean, he's magnetic. He's incredible. That's kind of what made him famous for a lot of people. And then, of course, we go on to Mandalorian and The Last of Us and just all the things that he can do. The range that he has as an actor is just really incredible. And I almost kind of at several times was like, I wish this movie was about him instead. Like you pointed out Macrinus, in terms of like a hero, I kind of wanted to see like
Yeah.
what a Pedro Pascal gladiator led movie would have been like, because
Low key.
he's married to Connie Nielsen in this movie, so
Mm-hmm.
he's more tied into the empire and to Rome, and he has to serve under the two twin brothers here played by Joseph Quinn and Fred Hetchinger. But yeah, they just don't do a ton with him here, and then they use him physically for a couple of scenes, but it's not the greatest stuff at all for him, and I just felt like it was another
Mm-hmm.
big name talent that just didn't get served properly throughout the film.
Yeah, it was so unfortunate, and especially because I think the conundrum in the film with his character Lucius and the Emperor's work, I thought that was an interesting kind of problem to kind of be in, like in the way Lucius thought about him as a character, in the way in his actual stance. I was like, wait, no, that's actually compelling. And then they don't do anything with him. I don't know. It's like, why don't we flesh that idea out? That there's a lot of misconceptions going on here, and they don't really play with that. They play with it for a little bit, but they don't really give Pedro Pascal the room or ability to mess with what's going on in that story there. So I agree. It would have been nice to see him as a little bit more of a hero there. But yeah, I thought he'd be in the movie more, and I thought he had more to work with. Neither one of those turned out to be true.
Yeah, I mean, they even allude to the fact that he knew Maximus, and he says himself, like, I would have done anything for Maximus. I served under him. I would have done anything. Or now he's like a general in the Roman army. And so he's also kind of living in the shadow, and he's married to Lucilla, who had a relationship with Maximus. There's a lot that they could have done there, and again, I think that might have just been a more interesting movie, again, to not have it overshadowed by the first movie, because you make Lucius Maximus's son. But okay, let's go to a different aspect of like this world, the Roman Empire, and somehow maybe he ends up as a gladiator. He gets cast out from the Roman army. I don't know. I'm just making up stuff, but it feels like that there would have been more to explore from his character standpoint, from that respect. But I do want to talk about the battle sequences. Of course, that's like what a lot of people come to these movies for. There's a lot of battles in this movie. I think that there's definitely more in this one than there are in the first one. And they're all pretty unique and different. And, very much, one is not like the other. Some are intimate, some are big and grand and huge and epic. What were your thoughts on just the battle sequences, how they looked, some of the new tricks that they employed here? Because again, this was the one element that they couldn't really replicate from the first one. You can't necessarily do the same stuff you did in the first one. They had to get, I guess, kind of creative and certainly take some liberties at several points. But what were your thoughts on just like the overall battle sequences?
When it comes to the small scale stuff, I enjoyed that stuff thoroughly, because I always like when you can give us, like you said, some of those, I like when you give us intimate fighting moments and they turn the sound off and you hear nothing but punches. And I will always be a sucker for stuff like that because it feels realistic, especially when there's like not a lot of cuts, turning back and forth. It's like, oh yeah, no, y'all really in it. And it had a couple scenes like that here, and I enjoyed those scenes. I thought those are pretty good, well choreographed scenes. I like the sound design. Actually really like the sound design in this film. But yeah, I thought they did a good job in a lot of those regards. The big action stuff was, depending on what it was and which one is what was going on, it was fine for me. I'm also sometimes I could be a history nerd, and I'm like, there wasn't no sharks in there. But like, it was still like sometimes cool seeing what he went for though, and what he thought was going to be the big action set pieces in this film. I think that stuff was interesting, and so for the most part, I did like some of those set pieces, the water and stuff. But I don't know. There's moments in the bigger pieces that I think I was just a little bit nitpicky with. Like, oh, what if you did this thing? But for the most part, I love the camera angles. I love what he went for. And I mostly had a good time with that stuff for sure.
Yeah, the intimate, smaller battles are better for sure.
Yeah.
We get 3 fights, like the bigger fights in the arenas. There's a fight between the gladiators and CGI baboons. There is a fight with gladiators and a rhino, and then the one you just alluded to, there's a big naval battle in the Roman Colosseum where there's sharks in the Colosseum. None of these worked for me. I'm just going to be honest. Like this it's silly. First of all, humans fighting baboons, you are going to get your fucking face eaten off 10 times out of 10. There is no situation in which everybody survives. And after that fight, most of the gladiators survive. I think one of them died.
Yep.
If you actually had some rabid baboons out there fighting you, let's see how you do. That was just ridiculous. And again, we're going back to CGI creation, CGI
Hmm.
creatures. I mean, in no reality, because could they have used real baboons?
Yeah, no. That's exactly why they had to go with these weird
But you know,
howling monkey
but you know
things.
what's
Yeah.
funny? In 2000, they had real fucking tigers in those arenas. I don't
Yeah, they
know.
did.
I don't know what, it's different. It's a different time. Again, ethically, there's just certain things we wouldn't do anymore. Peter would have a fucking fit. But I don't know, man. I'm just old school. I'm like, man, just get the real animals back. Just gotta,
Yeah.
can we just go back to that? It's just, but there's no, situation in which that could have been real. A rhino, that was probably of the big scale stuff, probably the most interesting one, but
Mhm.
I don't know. Somehow Lucius defeated him by throwing sand in his eye. That's all it took. That was just like a choice to me. Like that was just not effective. And then the sharks in the Coliseum. I mean, my goodness, we're just completely going into campy territory at that particular point.
Yeah.
Now, researchers have pointed out that yes, there were technically naval battles in the Roman Coliseum. That
Mhm,
happened,
mhm.
but shark
The
transportation,
sharks?
how we're
Yeah.
getting sharks from the ocean to the Roman Coliseum
Mm.
in 211 AD. Don't know how that's going to work back then. That's not really a thing. It was just silly. It was just like too much, just too much. You had to suspend your disbelief. Again, if you like that craziness of it and I guess the creativity behind it, that was okay. But yeah, the smaller stuff was the best. I don't. Did you have a favorite battle out of everything that we saw in the movie? Like one that stood out in particular for you?
Oh, the one where he had to fight for Denzel in the room with the Emperor, whatever that fight was. That was the really cool fight. It was
Oh,
him,
at the dinner party.
the dinner
Yeah,
party.
yeah.
Yeah, I like that fight because it's like y'all are twisted. Like this is what y'all. It actually reminded me of really racist, like like slavery Mandingo
Oh yeah.
fights. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying?
Yep.
It reminded me of that. Of like, no, y'all are really savages, and these emperors are nuts because y'all really. Oh, we're getting swords now. Okay, so everybody in the room is going to see somebody get slaughtered. What are we doing? You know what I'm saying? But like that craziness felt accurate to an extent, and I love how I love how it was still intimate even though everybody was watching. I thought that was a pretty good fight.
Yeah, I like that fight a lot too. And you pointed this out earlier. It was legible. You could see the action clearly. Long takes, not a lot of cutting. It was all just like very easy to watch and see, which a lot of
Yeah.
these filmmakers are not really adept at doing these days. You get a lot of fights that just look terrible on screen because there's
Hmm.
shaky cam. There's a million cuts. Like it's like, what am I even watching anymore? It looks like it's just like a bunch of slop on screen. But this one is like, no, you see every punch, every stab, every grunt, everything that they're doing there. It was pretty incredible stuff. I think my favorite, though, to be honest, and it
Hmm.
is like a bigger one, is the opening siege at the very beginning of the movie. I
Mm.
really like that one. I like that
That's
one a
pretty good.
lot because there was no craziness in terms of like animals and baboons and shit. Like it was just like humans battling each other. But it
Yeah.
reminded me of the opening siege in the original Gladiator. It was a little bit different though, and I thought it was like pretty well executed. I liked it a lot.
Hmm.
It felt like a proper introduction to this new story, and it got me actually excited about the movie. The rest of the movie let me down, but when I saw this, I was like, oh yeah, this is like back in that world. This is what really does best. Like these huge extras
Hmm.
and epic battles. It's on bridges and on these tall structures and it's near the water. There's boats and all that stuff, flying arrows, really, really cool stuff. And so it kind of peaked early for me in that respect, but it was cool. And then there was like the final battle. There's a final battle between Macrinus and Lucius, which I know
Yes.
it lasted like maybe 3 minutes. It was kind of like Jake Paul and Mike Tyson, like this old withered veteran who gets like a couple of good hits off, and then like the young guy is like, hold the fuck up,
Man.
dude. Like let's chill out. And then the movie kind of ends
Accurate.
there. Yeah, it was pretty
Racially accurate. That shit
racially.
accurate. That shit accurate as hell.
It's
Age accurate.
kind
It's
of
all
on
accurate.
point.
Yep.
But yeah, that was what it was. What it was. We got a little bit of, I guess, choreography from Denzel in terms of what he could do. But yeah, ultimately this movie, again, it released opposite, of Wicked, and there was a lot of box office expectations as it related to it as well. We did some predictions last week. It was tracking as high as 80 million domestic. We both took the under because that just felt really, really ridiculously high. And we were correct on that, but it still made $55.5 million domestically, which is another huge opening
Hmm.
weekend. In fact, it was the biggest opening weekend for Denzel Washington's career up until this point. And also it came out internationally a week before it released here stateside, and it made $87 million in its global opening weekend. And currently it's sitting at 314 million globally. So it's already being very, very successful at the box office. It's going to continue to make more and more people are going to go see it. And so I think it'll be fine in terms of just box office success. But we should also talk about Oscar chances with this as well, because again, I think similar to Wicked, this is another big movie that, a lot of people are going to go see that probably has a lot more implications now than probably we would have even predicted a few months ago. But considering like where things are, the landscape, how I guess the lack of competition in certain categories, and what this could look like, what do you ultimately think that this could do in terms of just Oscar predictions and certain categories it might be recognized in when it comes time for that award ceremony in March?
And it's so interesting. I think sound, just as personal one, I really like the sound in this movie. I think they did a pretty good job of communicating in very clearly and legibly seeing what this movie should sound like. I think it's a shoe in for sound. Man, the talk about Denzel, I think he'll be nominated here for best supporting actor. Production design, I can't take that away from the film, man. They did a lot of rebuilding Rome. This is one thing I didn't say during my review is this is a very expensive movie, and I will admit I can see it on screen. There's a lot of movies where I feel like these big budgets happen and I'm like, did that cost that much? You know what I mean? Like,
the money's not on the screen.
The money is not on the screen. Gladiator, the money was there. I got to give it to him there. The money was there. The costumes, the building of sets, it all was there. Even CGI stuff. I'm like, yeah, I could actually see where the money was. So I'll give it that as well. Costumes, yes. And visual effects, I could see it being nominated as well. So a lot of the, like, under the line stuff I can see. But yeah, costume, sound, and production design. I don't know about the above the line stuff. I'm not sure yet because I just don't know how the Academy is thinking. Me personally, I wouldn't put it in any of that. Like, I wouldn't put it in best picture, honestly. I wouldn't put it in best director, any of those. But there's still very potential and a possibility that movie ends up in a lot of those places. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think all the below the line stuff it's a shoe in. I think it'll get best director. I think Ridley will get nominated for sure.
You think so?
I think so. I think for sure. He certainly won't win, but I think he will get nominated. He's never won, in fact, which is interesting. Ridley's never won best director.
Crazy. Who won in 2000?
It's a good question. I'll have to look that up. I'm not sure, but he did not win in 2000. It might was it Sam Mendes for American Beauty? I'm not sure. Maybe no. That was probably
yeah, that's right.
It was Sam Mendes for American Beauty.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that, but I think he'll get nominated and recognized this year for sure. Best Picture is hard. I'm not sure if it'll go as far as Best Picture to get nominated for that. It may, again, to get sort of another noisy, loud film in that category in a year that lacks noisy, loud, big films. But I'm not as gung ho on that one as I am about Best Director. I almost feel like that's like a shoe in for him as well. Because he also, it was interesting to see like how recognized Napoleon was last year. I remember being quite surprised at how much recognition that movie got. But then you have to remember, it's like, this is an incredible production. Like this is Hollywood. This is movie making. And so it deserved all that stuff. And I think we're going to get a lot of that, sort of repetitive behavior here for Gladiator. So it'll be nominated and recognized. I don't think it'll win a thing. It'll get like 8 nominations and walk away winless. I think, even though I do agree Denzel will get nominated, he won't win. Ridley will get nominated, he won't win. And I think all the below the line stuff, maybe with the exception of sound, that's the one it probably could win first and foremost above anything. But I don't know. We'll have to see. I still think Dune Part 2 is like looming in the background right there. So it'll be an interesting race once we see those nominations all shape out. Any final thoughts on Gladiator 2? You want to see Gladiator 3? You want to see any more Gladiator from this world? Or do you think we should close the book forever on this story?
Just close the book, man. Leave Gladiator alone. Let's move on. Let's do something else. But yeah, I'm still interested to see. It's so interesting how all these old filmmakers are still kicking, man. And Ridley is not of no exception. It's kind of crazy to see how he could come out and make this film. I do not want to take that away from him. Again, most of my issues are not with the filmmaking. It's with story aspects and other things and other choices that were made. He's still so talented. as a filmmaker. Oh, and also I was wrong. Technically, that was 2000, where but remember that it was in 2001. Technically,
The ceremony was in
Oscar.
01. Yes,
Yeah. So technically, he lost to Steven Soderbergh for Traffic, which a choice.
I like
I don't
Traffic a
know,
lot, but I don't know if I agree.
but
with that
I
one.
think that should have been Ridley's W, bro. I'm sorry. I think it should have been Ridley's dub. I really do. But yeah, man, still, it was still, I think, a fun experiment. Gladiator 2 didn't turn out how I wanted to, but yeah, excited to see more blockbusters where we see money on the screen. I'm a praise the movie for that for sure. Constantly, like I can see the money on the screen, and I hope more blockbusters in the future. I kind of hold that same weight, man. So yeah.
Yeah, no more gladiators. I think we're good on this. In fact, I think duologies, like we kind of need more of those. Like there was a time where duologies was like very constant, where we would get 1 and 2, but we would never get 3. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Like let's get back to that. Everybody doesn't necessarily deserve 3 films, especially considering that this one came a full 24 years after the first one. So I'm actually fine that this, might close the book on this one. On this particular story. So I think we're good there. That man, Steve. So what's interesting? I think Steven Soderbergh in 01, he won for his lesser film. I think he should have won for Aaron Brockovich instead of Traffic. He was nominated twice that year because he made 2 films. I like Aaron Brockovich better than Traffic. And so if he was going to win for a film, I would have picked that one. But Ridley probably still should have won that year. But
which is crazy because Julia won for
she won
Aaron
for
Brockovich, and then Benicio won for Traffic.
It was a crazy year for Soderbergh.
He had a lot going on.
It was a crazy year for Soderbergh.
Insane.
And then Ocean's 11 released that year, so he won those awards, and Ocean's 11 came in that year.
He's cooking.
So, yeah, he certainly made a name for himself. But at the end of the day, this was, again, it was okay for what it was, and I agree about Ridley as just like where he's at in his life, his age. You ask him about retiring, and he'll answer like, "The fuck for? Why would I retire? Like I'm good at this. Like I could still do this. I'm still kicking. I still have other things that I want to do." And I'm like, I'm here for that. Really, like do what you want to do. If you still are capable, you still are of sound mind, and you're 87 and still being able to do this and be sharp, which he clearly is capable of doing. We've seen that time and time again. Though his movies might not always be great in this later stage, he's still producing at an extremely, extremely high level. Like we're living in a special time just knowing that he can deliver this type of film at that particular age. And so I respect it. I'm always here for it, and I definitely admire him for that work. But folks, those are all of our thoughts on Gladiator 2. If you've checked out this movie, definitely hit us up and let us know what you think.